North Korea is one of the most closed countries in the world, and throughout its entire existence, it has been ruled by a single dynasty, the Kim dynasty. Let's find out how the Kims came to rule Korea. Since the late 19th century, Japan has had a huge influence on Korea. Following the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, the Treaty of Portsmouth was signed, formally accepting Japanese control of Korea. In 1910, Japan officially recognized Korea as a colony. It was now governed by a Japanese governor-general. As World War II approached, Japan increased its pressure. The empire underwent a massive military buildup. The use of slave labor increased, and some Koreans were forced to take Japanese names and worship Japanese gods. Yet the Koreans did not submit to their oppressors without a fight. Over 200,000 Korean resistance fighters took up arms against the Japanese in guerrilla warfare. Many of those who fought adopted communist ideas under the influence of the USSR. One of those guerrilla leaders was Kim Sang-ju. After World War II, the issue of Korean independence became a stumbling block for the Allies. The USSR began spreading its ideology and intended to make Korea communist. The United States could not allow this, so a plan was chosen to create occupation zones on the peninsula. At this moment of change, the Korean people themselves decided to fill the vacuum and began to create their own administration. But this was not part of the Allies' plans. Everyone fought for their share of the peninsula: Koreans, Americans, and Soviets. In November 1947, the UN began holding elections to establish democracy on the Korean peninsula, but the Soviets wouldn't let them into their territory beyond the 38th parallel. They feared that free elections would weaken their strong influence in the north. Elections only took place in the southern half of Korea. North Korea took a completely different direction. This is where Kim Sang-ju, the leader of the Korean communist guerrillas, comes back into the picture. He gained fame in Korea after his unit attacked a small Japanese garrison in 1937 on the border between China and Korea. The guerrillas were soon defeated, and Kim moved to the USSR in 1941. In the Soviet Union, Kim was recruited into the Soviet army and became a captain. For propaganda purposes, a company of Koreans was formed, led by Kim. After occupying North Korea in 1945, the Soviet leadership decided to appoint Kim Sang-ju as the leader of the local communists. Kim was considered one of their own, unlike the Korean underground fighters, whom the Soviets did not trust. Thus, Captain Kim became the leader of the Korean communists. By this time, he had adopted the name Kim Il-sung. By 1946, the propaganda machine was already in full swing. This was the beginning of the Kim personality cult. They used art and media to portray themselves as godlike figures to the North Korean people. 3 months after Lee Sin-min's election in the South, Kim officially proclaimed the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and himself as its leader. From the very first days of his rule, his main idea was the unification of the country. After all, both regimes in the South and the North considered themselves the only true and legitimate ones. And from 1949, Kim Il-sung began seeking help from the USSR and China and organizing a military campaign against South Korea. By this time, almost all American troops had withdrawn from the southern neighbor, leaving it virtually undefended. Initially, Stalin ignored Kim Il-sung's requests, but the communist victory in China and the successful test of Soviet nuclear weapons forced him to reconsider. Soviet military advisors participated in developing the attack plan, and former Soviet officers taught the DPRK army military art. On June 25, 1950, DPRK troops crossed the border into the Republic of Korea. In the 3-year war, approximately 1.5 million Koreans were killed and wounded, and more than 80% of all buildings were destroyed. The Korean War ended with a ceasefire agreement in 1953. However, since a formal peace treaty was never technically signed, the two Koreas are still in a state of war. After the war, Korea, with the help of China and the USSR, began to rebuild its country, playing a game of defection between China and the USSR, first leaning more toward one, then toward the other. As a result, the DPRK created its own personal ideology, Juche, self-reliance. Although this of course was a formality, since even under Juche, Korea did not refuse assistance from China. From the very beginning of his reign until his death, the leader of the Korean people attached the utmost importance to heavy industry and the army. This had a very negative impact on the country, quickly causing shortages of everyday goods. And after aid from the USSR and China decreased, the country sank deeper into crisis. The famine of the 1990s culminated in a famine that killed up to 3 million people, but they don't talk about this in North Korea. Without improvements in people's lives, a dictatorship is simply necessary, and in this, the Kims have been very successful. Modeled on China and the USSR back in the late 1940s, it incorporated a cult of personality, complete censorship of all media, and control by the secret services. By banning everything possible, he kept the country in his hands. Kim Il-sung tolerated no one who could interfere with the regime or himself. Even close allies could quickly disappear if they said something they shouldn't. This principle will be carried forward by all Kims into the 21st century. In fact, both in the 1950s and now, power remains in the hands of the Kim dynasty. Brothers, sisters, and parents all hold important positions, and that doesn't mean regime change will happen. And that's all. Subscribe to the channel, like it, and write topics in the comments. Also, see how China became a great power and what happened in the Cold War between the USSR and the USA.